Hello, my name is Steve Finn, and in this section I'm going to talk to you about assessment intervention sessions in therapeutic assessment. Assessment intervention sessions are a relatively new addition to the semi-structured format of therapeutic assessment. These sessions typically occur after all the standardized testing has been completed that is needed to address the client's questions for the assessment, and before the summary discussion or feedback sessions with the client. In fact, assessment intervention sessions were developed to make summary discussion sessions more successful and therapeutic. The techniques used in assessment intervention sessions are adapted from those collaborative assessment strategies developed by Constance Fisher for what she called the assessment up process. If you wish to become an expert at assessment intervention sessions, I recommend that you read the section of Fisher's 1985 book, Individualizing Psychological Assessment, that concerns assessment of process. You may also want to read the various published case examples of assessment intervention sessions, some of which are included in my own book, In Our Client's Shoes. Now let me describe in detail the goals of assessment intervention sessions in therapeutic assessment. The first goal of an assessment intervention session is to further explore hypotheses derived from the standardized tests about the client's problems in living. For example, at the beginning of an assessment, a client may have asked, "Why am I unable to watch sad movies or TV shows? If someone puts one on, I have to leave the room." From the client's Rorschach scores, you may have developed the hypothesis that the client is very prone to emotional flooding and tends to back away from emotional situations. In an assessment intervention session, you have a chance to further explore and test out this hypothesis, perhaps by exposing the client to some sad stimuli, like dysphoric TAT cards, and watching how the client handles this situation. If the client shuts down and becomes mute, you'll have confirmation of your hypothesis, as well as a real sense of what emotional withdrawal looks like in this particular client. Furthermore, if you and the client can observe the results of this experiment together, many new learnings can occur. This leads to the second major goal of assessment intervention sessions, which is to help clients understand and become aware of assessment findings. It would be possible, in the previous example, to talk about the client's Rorschach scores in a summary discussion session and use those to help address his question of why he can't watch sad movies. But imagine how much more powerful it would be if you could create a situation where the client came to understand the Rorschach scores in a concrete way and could then answer his own assessment question. The experiment I mentioned earlier with the TAT cards has the potential to lead the client to this type of new understanding. This point relates to the next goal of assessment intervention sessions, to help clients become aware of assessment findings that are otherwise likely to be rejected. Assessment intervention sessions are especially useful in those assessments where the assessor thinks he or she has learned very important information through the standardized testing, but believes that such information would be very threatening to clients because it conflicts in some fundamental way with their existing stories about themselves. A successful assessment intervention session can help clients assimilate challenging information while reducing the risk that they will undergo a disintegration experience. This leads me to the next goal, which is for clients to discover or trip over an assessment finding on their own, with the guidance of the assessor. As I discussed in the other lecture on this DVD, a principle of therapeutic assessment is that if clients actively collaborate in revising their existing stories about themselves in the world, they're less likely to experience disintegration and more likely to achieve therapeutic shifts during an assessment. The techniques and procedures of assessment intervention sessions are grounded in this principle. If you can succeed at bringing one of the client's problem behaviors into the assessment room, where it may be observed and discussed, you can achieve yet another goal of assessment intervention sessions, to test out possible interventions in clients' problem behaviors. Such tests can lead to much more informed and realistic recommendations at the end of an assessment, as you will have a chance to find out which possible solutions do and don't work for that particular client. This leads to the next goal, which is to give clients an experience of implementing more adaptive solutions to their dilemmas of change. If clients can, with the guidance of the assessor, find new ways to address a problem behavior in the assessment session, they will often have hope and excitement about new ways to act in their daily lives. Also, clients will have an emotional and physical memory of what it was like to act differently, which can help them generalize adaptive solutions to their outside lives. The final and most general goal of assessment intervention sessions is one I mentioned earlier, to prepare clients for the summary discussion sessions. The assessor uses information derived from earlier stages in the assessment to help clients explore and understand problematic aspects of their lives. As a result, clients come to the summary discussion session with a host of new awarenesses and understandings, and the assessor has a better sense of what to say in the summary discussion session in addressing the client's questions for the assessment. Now let me discuss the steps involved in conducting assessment intervention sessions. You won't use all of these steps with every client, but I'll describe all of them here and give an example that illustrates each step. Step 1 is to plan beforehand by asking yourself, how can I elicit the problem behavior in vivo? The answer to this question should be based on what you've learned from the standardized testing and from your previous interactions with the client. Also, you should choose a problem behavior to focus on what the client has asked about in an assessment question. You will also choose a problem behavior to explore that you think may be particularly difficult for the client to grasp in a summary discussion session alone. For example, a number of years ago, a man came to me for a therapeutic assessment because of problems he was experiencing in his job as an accountant. This client, whom I'll call Mr. O, explained that his boss was constantly threatening to fire him because he thought Mr. O worked too slowly. Mr. O was outraged about these threats and felt that they were totally unfair. He agreed that he was less productive than his coworkers, but he took pride in the fact that he never made mistakes in his work. Mr. O explained that when other people in the office had difficulties reconciling an account, they would consult him, and he would always discover where the error had occurred. In some instances, he had uncovered serious accounting errors involving hundreds of thousands of dollars, which had balanced out to make differences that appeared to be only a few cents. If Mr. O had not caught the errors involved, the company could have been in some serious trouble. Mr. O did recognize that his boss was more concerned about efficiency than perfect accuracy, and his main question for the assessment was, why can't I work more quickly, even though I know that this is what my boss wants, and what will be necessary for me to work more quickly? He agreed to personality testing, and I gave him the MMPI-2 and the Rorschach. Mr. O's test results showed a great deal of anxiety, perfectionism, and compulsive coping mechanisms. He had extreme elevations on MMPI-2 scales 7 and OBS, and his Rorschach had a ZD of plus 10.5, a positive obsessionality index, and many DD99 locations that resulted from his trying to get things just perfect when he identified the locations of his Rorschach percepts. It was clear to me from our earlier discussions that Mr. O did not identify his compulsive style as problematic or even as inefficient. Thus, I chose to focus on this problem behavior in the assessment intervention session, remembering also that this was the topic of his main assessment question. In executing step 1, I thought carefully about what tasks would bring Mr. O's compulsive style and slow pace of work into the assessment room, where we could observe it, discuss it, and explore it. I considered many different options, and finally chose to ask Mr. O to do the Bender Visual Motor Gestalt test with me. If you're unfamiliar with this task, the assessor asks the client to copy geometric figures from a set of cards onto a sheet of paper. I anticipated that Mr. O would be slower and more exacting compared to the average person when executing his drawings. I told him at the beginning of the session that we would be doing an activity that would help us explore his question of what was needed for him to work more quickly at his accounting job. I was not terribly surprised when he asked if he could use a ruler to draw the first card. It takes most people less than 10 seconds to copy the first card of the Bender Gestalt. I timed Mr. O, and it took him 1 minute and 23 seconds. I noticed this and was satisfied that I had succeeded in eliciting the problem behavior I wished to focus on. I was also grateful for the MMPI-2 in Rorschach in helping me get in his shoes and knowing what task it would be that would elicit the problem behavior. Now, it's useful to have several instances of the behavior being examined in an assessment intervention session. So I then gave Mr. O the second card to copy, and it took him several minutes to complete it. The next step of an assessment intervention session is to enlist the client in observing and naming the problem behavior. In particular, you should ask what the client calls the behavior and how he or she explains or understands it. I asked Mr. O if he would describe how he had approached the first two cards of the Bender, and he said, carefully and with precision. We agreed that this was his usual style of approaching tasks like this, and I asked him if he had a sense of how much time he had taken doing his drawings compared to most other people. Mr. O said, I imagine I was a little bit slower, but not that much. He was surprised when I then told him that he had taken considerably more time than most people, and he countered with, but I bet I didn't make any mistakes. We both smiled and then had a discussion of the pros and cons of carefulness versus speed. I then initiated the next step of an assessment intervention, which is to generalize the in-session behavior to the client's outside life. I asked Mr. O if our discussion related at all to his work, and he said that it did perfectly. I observed that while it appeared that he himself would always choose carefulness and precision over speed, it seemed that his boss had other values. He agreed and told me how this made no sense to him at all. I listened carefully and sympathized with how difficult it was to conform to a boss's values when they went against one's own. I even told of an instance where I had been in a similar situation in a job and how frustrated I had been at the time. Mr. O grew calmer as I talked and then asked, so, I guess, do you think we should talk now about my question of how I can work more quickly? This interchange illustrates another principle of therapeutic assessment discussed in the other lecture on this DVD, namely that it is the holding environment created by the assessor-client relationship that gives the client the support needed to risk new behaviors and understandings. I think if I had not been so sympathetic to Mr. O's plight, he would have continued to defend his particular way of approaching his work and the Bender Gestalt. Instead, Mr. O was able to get curious about his next steps and to suggest, with some anxiety, that we try to modify his behavior. In the next step of the assessment intervention, the assessor explores the context of the problem behavior with the client. Specifically, what factors are necessary and sufficient to produce the problem behavior? I told Mr. O that before we tried to speed him up, it would be useful to know more about what he was experiencing when he drew the Bender Gestalt figures. Could he tell me what he was thinking and what he felt in his body when he did the drawings? Mr. O said he wasn't aware of any specific thoughts, but if there were any, they would be things like, don't make any mistakes now. You're being observed and evaluated. You don't want to do anything silly. He said he didn't feel anything in his body except for a slight sense of tension, which he connected again to knowing that someone else was watching and evaluating his behavior. I asked Mr. O if this gave him any ideas as to how we might help him go faster. This is the next step of the assessment intervention, in which the assessor and client imagine possible solutions to the problem behavior being studied. Mr. O volunteered that he might have to change his thoughts. I was pleased and agreed this was worth a try, and I suggested we generate a list of thoughts that might lead to speedier drawing. We took a piece of paper and wrote down 3 new ones. It's okay in this situation to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes from time to time, and perfection is not required on this task. These were all worded in Mr. O's own words. He said he wasn't sure that he believed these statements, so I pulled down my Bender-Gestalt scoring manual and showed him the range of copied figures that would earn a perfect score. Mr. O was amazed at how sloppy the average drawings were, in his words, but said that this helped him know what was expected. I then gave him the 3rd Bender-Gestalt card, and he was able to copy it with no scoreable errors in only 45 seconds. This is still slower than the average person, but it was an improvement, and I commended Mr. O and asked him how he felt about this trial. He said it wasn't too bad. We agreed to keep trying different things that could help him go faster. In this section of the assessment intervention, when one is exploring possible solutions with the client, it's helpful if the assessor has experience with different types of therapeutic interventions. For example, I then put on my behavior therapist hat with Mr. O and told him that I had noticed that he was holding his pencil quite tightly as he drew. He agreed and said that he had never noticed this before. I wondered if this was a sign of some anxiety, and he said that was an interesting thought. I then asked Mr. O if he had ever heard of a technique called progressive relaxation. He had not. I explained it, had Mr. O close his eyes, and then led him through a 15-minute trial of progressive relaxation. Afterwards, I asked him to copy the 4th Bender-Gestalt card. This time, he completed his drawing in only 30 seconds, which again is longer than most people, but we stopped to reflect and celebrate. I asked Mr. O how he felt about the new, speedier way he was doing his drawings. He said, it's kind of fun, but said that he still found himself worrying about making mistakes. I then put on my psychodynamic therapist hat and asked Mr. O if he had any ideas about where he had learned that mistakes were so costly and should be avoided. He then told a poignant story of his father's exacting standards while he was growing up, and how his father had taught him and his siblings to type by standing behind them with a ruler and hitting them on the head whenever they made a mistake. Apparently, this was a strategy Mr. O's father had learned from a popular book at the time called Cheaper by the Dozen. To this day, Mr. O said he was a fast and mistake-free typist. I asked him what he thought about this kind of parenting approach, and he said he wasn't sure. He was a little confused. He was glad to be such an excellent typist, and it had helped him in many different situations, but he thought it was a stressful way to have learned. I looked him directly in the eye, said I agreed, and then that I thought his father's teaching method was still with him and causing him problems at his job. Mr. O grew a bit misty-eyed and said he could see how this was so. After a bit of silence, where we both sat with this new understanding, I then asked Mr. O to draw one more Bender-Gestalt figure. He drew this one quite rapidly, and even to my amazement let himself make a small mistake. When he ended, he threw down his pencil and gave me a big smile. I gave him a high five, and we laughed, and he said, "That felt good." I asked him to say more about this, and he said, "I felt so free." I asked if he was aware of the small mistake he had made. He said he was, but that he had figured out that it wouldn't be counted against him. I said, "Indeed it will not," and showed him the Bender-Gestalt scoring manual again. Mr. O smiled. He said, "What a very useful session this has been." The last step in an assessment intervention is to generalize the solutions explored to the outside context. Mr. O and I envisioned what it might be like to try some of what we had tried in our session at his work the next day. We conducted thought experiments in various contexts, and I asked if he could foresee any particular difficulties in trying these new solutions. He said he could not, and I asked him to report back at our next session at how things had gone. When I saw him the next time, Mr. O told me about the successes and struggles he had had trying to work more quickly and worry less about mistakes at his job. Apparently, he had been fairly successful in his new strategy, but his boss and co-workers had been surprised and concerned at his new speedy approach. They had asked him repeatedly if he was okay. We talked a bit about how systems compensate for changes in individual members by trying to reestablish the old homeostasis. He grasped this concept immediately and said he would persevere in his new approach. This is an example of an assessment intervention session using the Bender Gestalt, and I hope you can see how it gave Mr. O an immediate and vivid example of assessment findings and how it helped him gain a new insight into his problem behavior and to try out new ways of being and thinking. If you want to learn more about assessment intervention sessions, I refer you to Chapter 8 of my book, In Our Client's Shoes, where you will read about many different assessment intervention sessions and how they can be applied to different types of client problem behaviors. Thank you very much.